Robert lived alone in a small house at the edge of a quiet town. His home, nestled near the woods, stood on the outskirts of town, a place of solitude and routine. Each day, he followed the same pattern: a visit to the local market, a few brief exchanges with the few townsfolk he knew, then back to the quiet of his house. The days stretched on in this way, and while the silence was comfortable at first, over the years, it had begun to feel like a heavy weight. One Thursday, as Robert made his way to the market, something unusual caught his attention. A small calico cat, her fur soft and her eyes bright, trotted beside him. At first, Robert thought it was just a stray, but the cat stayed close, weaving around his feet and following him as he walked. "Well, aren't you persistent?" Robert muttered to himself. He kept walking, but the cat kept following, matching his pace. Robert smiled faintly, deciding to humor her. By the time he reached his front door, the cat was right there, sitting at his feet. With a soft sigh, he bent down and opened the door. "I guess you're staying then," he said, more to himself than to the cat. The cat, with a gentle meow, stepped inside without hesitation. Robert wasn't used to having a companion, but there was something comforting about her presence. He decided to name her Cookie, after the tin of cookies he kept on the kitchen counter. The cat quickly settled in, curling up in the sunniest spot or following him from room to room, her green eyes never straying too far. Days passed, and Cookie became more than just a stray. She was a companion, something Robert hadn't realized he needed. Yet there was something peculiar about her. She had an odd habit of sitting in the same spots at odd times, by the old rocking chair, near the faded photographs of his late wife, or staring out the window as though watching for something. One evening, Robert woke to find Cookie sitting in front of an old drawer where he kept letters from his past. She sat still, staring intently at the drawer as if expecting something to happen. Curious, Robert opened the drawer, but found only dust-covered papers and a few photographs of his younger years. He frowned, feeling a strange unease. The next day, Cookie spent hours sitting by a cracked mirror in the hallway, her eyes fixed on her reflection. Robert watched her curiously but didn't understand why she kept returning to certain places. Each time she stared, she seemed to be waiting for something, as if expecting a sign. He tried to dismiss it as mere feline behavior, but the strange occurrences grew harder to ignore. There was something about the way Cookie looked at him, almost as if she were trying to communicate something he couldn't quite grasp. One night, as the rain pattered softly against the window, Cookie jumped onto Robert's lap, purring contentedly. She was warm and calm, but there was a quiet intensity in her gaze. Robert stroked her fur, and for a moment, he felt a connection, something deeper than just companionship. It was as if she were a part of something much bigger than him, a piece of a puzzle he wasn't sure he was ready to solve. The next morning, Cookie again returned to the same spot by the window, her eyes trained on the horizon. Robert watched her closely, the feeling of unease creeping in again. What was she waiting for? It wasn't just a simple animal's curiosity. There was purpose in her actions, a focus that seemed beyond ordinary behavior. Robert couldn't help but feel that Cookie was guiding him towards something, though he didn't know what it was. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window with Cookie nestled at his feet. Perhaps he thought Cookie had come into his life for a reason. But what was that reason? And what was the cat trying to show him? As the day wore on, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something that had been waiting for him all along. And Cookie, the strange, affectionate cat, was the one who held the key. Robert had always been a light sleeper, but the night he fell asleep in his favorite armchair, something was different. He drifted into an uneasy slumber, the kind that left his thoughts half-formed, the world around him blending into a blur. As he slept, the house was still, save for the soft ticking of the old clock on the mantel. At some point during the night, Robert stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and he blinked against the dim light filtering through the curtains. For a moment, he wasn't sure what had woken him. Then he saw her Cookie. She was sitting at the edge of his bed, her gaze fixed on him, unblinking and intense. Her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, the only light in the room. Robert's heart skipped a beat. It was as though she had been waiting for him to wake up. "Cookie?" he murmured groggily, his voice thick with sleep. The cat didn't move, still as a statue. Robert rubbed his eyes, thinking he must be imagining things. But when he looked again, she was still there. There was something unsettling about her presence, something that felt both familiar and strange at once. With a soft sigh, Robert closed his eyes again, convincing himself it was just a dream. But the image of Cookie's glowing eyes lingered in his mind long after he drifted back to sleep. The next morning, the sun was high in the sky when Robert finally awoke. He groggily made his way to the kitchen, but something felt off. The air in the house was heavy, thick with a strange tension. Cookie was sitting on the windowsill, her tail flicking back and forth. She looked at him as if she knew something he didn't. Shaking off the strange feeling, Robert went about his usual routine. But that night, when he closed his eyes to sleep, the dreams began, vivid and overwhelming. In the first dream, he found himself standing in a lush garden, the scent of flowers filling the air. It was a place he had never seen before, a secret, hidden corner of the world. The colors in the garden were vibrant and surreal. The leaves of the trees a rich shade of green, the flowers glowing softly in the moonlight. Felt like a dream, but it was too real, too tangible. Standing in the center of the garden was Cookie, her fur shining in the soft glow of the flowers. She sat on a stone path, her eyes fixed on him as if beckoning him closer. Robert stepped forward, his feet light on the ground, drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. It was as though the garden itself was alive, breathing, and welcoming him. As he approached, Cookie stood up and led him down a narrow stone path. The walls of the garden seemed to close in, and yet there was a sense of peace that surrounded him. Birds chirped in the distance, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves. Robert felt calm, as though all the burdens of his waking life had been lifted. "Where am I?" he asked quietly, though no answer came. Cookie simply walked ahead, her tail flicking with purpose. He followed her deeper into the garden, each step feeling like it was leading him somewhere important. But before he could ask another question, the dream shifted. The colors of the garden began to blur, the flowers wilting, the air growing heavy. He felt a sudden sense of loss, a pulling sensation that made his chest tighten. "Cookie!" he called, but the cat was already disappearing into the mist, her form fading like smoke. Robert woke up suddenly, his heart racing. His breath came in short gasps as he tried to make sense of the dream. His room was still, quiet as it had been before, but the lingering feeling of the garden, of Cookie's eyes guiding him, stayed with him. The next morning, Robert couldn't shake the vividness of the dream. It felt too real, as if it had been more than just his imagination. As he moved through his day, he found himself distracted, his thoughts drifting back to the secret garden. Cookie was acting strangely again. She was unusually attentive, following him around the house, always watching him with those unblinking eyes. It was as if she was waiting for something, guiding him with her presence. She led him to the old armchair, jumping onto the seat and curling up beside him with a soft purr, her body warm against his side. Robert couldn't help but wonder if Cookie was more than just a cat. There was something otherworldly about her, something that hinted at a deeper connection. It was as though she knew things he didn't, like she was trying to tell him something that he wasn't ready to understand. That evening, as Robert prepared for bed, he found himself feeling both exhausted and strangely restless. His mind was still caught in the fog of the dream, and as he closed his eyes to sleep, he couldn't help but wonder what Cookie would show him next. The dreams came nightly now, lush, vivid worlds that bloomed behind Robert's closed eyes like flowers in fast forward. Forests of impossible trees, oceans with colors no sea had ever known, skies that pulsed with swirling stars. And always Cookie was there, sometimes perched high above him on a twisting branch, other times walking beside him on glowing stone paths, but always watching, guiding. Robert awoke each morning with his heart stirred and his hands strangely restless. There was a yearning inside him he couldn't explain, as if the dreams had unlocked a door to something long buried. One rainy afternoon, with Cookie napping by the fire and the house wrapped in a soft hush, Robert decided to venture into the attic. It had been years since he'd gone up there, decades maybe, but something compelled him now, like a whisper rising from the shadows of his dreams. He climbed the creaky stairs slowly, each step groaning beneath his weight. Dust floated like memories in the beam of his flashlight. Old boxes, forgotten furniture, brittle papers, all untouched. But tucked behind a broken rocking horse and a trunk of old clothes, Robert found a small wooden crate. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, was a paintbrush. It was a simple thing, the handle worn smooth from use, the bristle stiff with age. But the moment he held it, a warmth spread through his fingers. A pulse, faint but unmistakable. Robert stared at it for a long moment, his breath catching in his throat. He had forgotten all about this brush. He'd used it in his youth, before life became quiet, before the world had slowly shrunk around him. Cradling it gently, he brought it downstairs. He hadn't painted in years, but the dreams, it was like they had left something inside him that needed to get out. That night, under the soft glow of a single lamp, Robert dug out an old canvas from the back of the closet, wiped the dust from it, and began to paint. First, his hand trembled. The colors felt foreign, the movements clumsy. But then something shifted. It was as if the brush moved on its own, guided by something deeper than memory. Colors flowed where he hadn't meant them to. Shapes appeared he didn't plan. The scene that took shape wasn't something he consciously imagined. It was the garden, the one from his dreams. The sky he painted shimmered with lavender and gold, and in the distance, the silhouette of a cat sat atop a stone archway, tail curled, gaze steady. Cookie sat at his feet the entire time, unusually still, her eyes locked on the painting with an almost reverent focus. When Robert finally put the brush down, he leaned back and stared. His heart pounded. The garden looked exactly as it had in his sleep. Every detail, every color, even the light. "How?" he whispered, barely breathing. Cookie blinked slowly, then hopped onto the table and sat beside the painting. She looked at him, then gently touched the canvas with her paw. Robert watched her, a chill crawling down his spine. It wasn't coincidence. He knew that now. These dreams, these visions, they were messages. And Cookie was the messenger. Over the next few days, Robert painted constantly. Every spare moment, he was at the easel. The scenes poured out of him, an endless river of landscapes and moments that seemed to belong to another world. Waterfalls suspended in sky, fields of flowers that sang, bridges made of light. And in nearly every painting, Cookie appeared. Sometimes obvious, sometimes hidden, but always there. The more he painted, the more he remembered. Not memories from his life, but memories from the dreams. As if they were places he had once visited long ago and had simply forgotten. The brush became an extension of him, like he had never stopped painting at all. One night, after finishing a painting of a forest with glowing leaves, Robert sat back and looked at Cookie. "Are you showing me these places?" he asked softly. "Or am I remembering them through you?" Cookie didn't answer, of course, but her gaze was steady, ancient, and full of something Robert could only describe as knowing. He felt the same way he had as a child, listening to the wind whisper through tall trees, aware of something bigger, older, just beyond the edge of understanding. As he turned out the light and headed to bed, Cookie jumped up to the windowsill and looked out into the night, her ears twitching at some sound only she could hear. Robert paused at the doorway and glanced back at the drying canvas. The painted world shimmered under the lamp, colors dancing like flame. Whatever this was, dream or memory, magic or madness, he knew one thing for sure: it had only just begun. The paintings had taken on a life of their own. What had started as dreamscapes on canvas now held a magnetism Robert couldn't explain. People from town, neighbors who once passed him with polite nods and little more, began to stop by unannounced. At first, it was just Margaret from the bakery, who dropped off bread and lingered at the doorway. Then it was Thomas, the postman, who stared at a painting of a golden staircase for so long he missed half his route. Soon others came, curious, drawn. "I don't know what it is," Margaret whispered one day, staring at a painting of a garden under a violet sky. "It feels like I've dreamed of this place before." Robert said nothing, only watched her closely. She stood so still, eyes wide and glassy, her fingers trembling as if remembering something too long buried. Others had similar reactions. One man wept openly in front of a scene depicting a floating city. A young girl smiled quietly at a meadow lit with crystal trees. Each person saw something different, but they all left changed. Robert didn't understand it. His brush moved from instinct now, almost beyond his control. It was as if something passed through him and into the canvas. He was the conduit, not the creator. And through it all, Cookie watched. She still slept in her usual sunlit spots and brushed against his ankles when he returned from errands. But there was something different. A stillness, a knowing. Sometimes she stared at the paintings for hours, her tail twitching, her eyes following invisible paths across the walls. Robert began to feel it too, a weight in the air, as if something was building. That night, he dreamed again. He stood in the hallway outside his bedroom. The house looked the same, but different, brighter somehow, alive with faint whispers and golden light pulsing from beneath the floorboards. Cookie was there, perched on the top step. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at him with her unblinking gaze, then turned slowly and walked toward the far end of the hall. Robert followed. In the dream, the hallway seemed longer than it ever had been. Endless. The wallpaper shimmered faintly, and the floor creaked beneath his bare feet. At the end of the corridor, Cookie stopped beside a section of the wall he had never given much thought to. There was a door, faint and faded, almost invisible, hidden behind the shadow of a bookshelf. Cookie looked back once, then vanished through it without a sound. Robert woke with a start. Sweat clung to his skin. The room was quiet, dim with morning light. Cookie lay on the windowsill, as if nothing had happened. But Robert couldn't shake the feeling. The dream had felt different, heavier, closer. He spent the morning pacing the hallway, searching every inch. At first, it felt foolish. A dream was just a dream. But then, his fingers brushed the wall behind the old bookshelf, and he felt it. A thin outline, a seam, a hidden door. Heart pounding, he pulled the shelf aside, revealing the shape. There was no knob, just a small indentation. Without thinking, he pressed his palm to it. A click. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into the dark. Cookie appeared beside him, silent as ever. Robert hesitated, then stepped forward. The stairs groaned under his weight, and the air grew cooler, thicker. At the bottom, he found a small room, dusty, untouched. Old wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with strange trinkets. Faded photographs, worn journals, fragments of fabric and stone. In the center of the room sat an easel, but it was not empty. A painting rested there, already finished. Robert moved closer, eyes wide. It was him, not as he was now, but younger, standing in a field of shifting light, Cookie beside him. The same garden from his earliest dreams stretched behind them, endless and glowing. And painted across the sky, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of a door. Robert staggered back. He had never seen this painting before, never touched this room. But the style, the brushwork, it was his. Cookie meowed softly, not the usual sound, but something low and resonant, like a note struck deep in the earth. Robert looked down at her, 1,000 questions rising to his lips, but none came out. He didn't understand what this meant, not fully, but he knew with a deep certainty that something had been set in motion long before Cookie ever walked into his life. And now it was beginning to reveal itself. The town had changed. What was once a quiet village with empty sidewalks and sleepy windows now buzzed with footsteps and whispers. Cars lined the narrow roads. Strangers knocked on Robert's door. Artists, collectors, reporters, skeptics. They all came for the paintings. Some offered money, envelopes thick with promises. Others just stared, silent and overwhelmed, unable to explain why the sight of Robert's work left them shaken or teary-eyed. One woman stood for nearly an hour before a canvas that showed a forest burning beneath a violet moon, murmuring that she had dreamed the exact same scene as a child. The attention unnerved Robert. He had never asked for an audience, never planned for recognition. He painted because he had to, because when he didn't, the dreams clawed at him. But the more he painted, the worse it became. At first, the dreams were beautiful. Otherworldly gardens, floating cities, rivers made of glass. But now they were darker, harsher. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision. Whispers echoed behind walls that shouldn't be there. Faces blurred and twisted. And always, Cookie watched, sitting quietly at the foot of his bed when he woke, eyes filled with something Robert didn't understand. He started to lose time, waking with a brush in hand. Hours passed with no memory. Paintings appeared on the easel, haunting, unfamiliar, as if made by someone else. His body ached. His hands trembled. His reflection grew thinner, paler, more hollow. One morning, he collapsed beside the easel, the room spinning. Cookie was beside him instantly, pawing gently at his sleeve. Her meow, soft and low, felt like a question, or maybe a warning. He sat up slowly, coughing. "I'm fine," he muttered, though the words tasted like dust. He wasn't fine. Something was draining him. He began noticing that each painting demanded more than the last. Not just time and energy, but something deeper, something essential. With every stroke, he felt more hollow, like the dreams were taking a piece of him to build their worlds. But he couldn't stop. He had tried, locked the attic, hid the brushes, refused to sleep. But the dreams came anyway, stronger, more urgent. The garden had wilted, the skies had darkened, and Cookie had started pacing, tail flicking, restless and agitated. One night, he dreamt of the hidden room again, the one beneath the house. But this time it was empty. The painting on the easel was gone. In its place stood Cookie, not as a cat, but something more. A figure cloaked in light and shadow, with eyes ancient and knowing. She said nothing, but Robert felt her gaze pierce through him. He awoke gasping, heart hammering. The next morning, he found a new canvas waiting on the easel. He didn't remember placing it there, but the moment he saw it, his hand reached instinctively for the brush, and he painted. The strokes came fast, fevered. His body trembled, sweat pooling at his brow. Time vanished. He didn't eat, didn't rest. Cookie stayed close, circling the room in slow, deliberate paths, as if protecting him from something he couldn't see. When the painting was done, Robert collapsed into the chair, chest heaving. On the canvas was a door, ornate and ancient, surrounded by stars. Behind it, faint outlines of all the places he had seen in dreams. The garden, the city, the river. But in the center of the door was a crack, and through it spilled something dark and cold. Robert shivered. Later that day, a man from the city came to see the painting. He stared at it for a long time, then turned to Robert and said, This isn't art, it's a key." Robert didn't answer. He couldn't, because somewhere deep inside, he feared the man was right. That night, he sat in silence, Cookie curled beside him. He was so tired, so thin. The dreams waited, just behind his eyes. And for the first time, he wondered if Cookie had known this would happen from the beginning. He looked down at her. "You're not just a cat, are you?" Cookie blinked, slow and solemn. Robert didn't expect an answer, but as he drifted into uneasy sleep, he felt her press closer, warmer than she'd ever been before, like a guardian or a farewell. Robert opened his eyes to a sky the color of twilight, neither night nor day. He stood on a narrow ridge, surrounded by a sea of stars above and below, as if the earth had folded itself into the cosmos. Wind stirred softly around him, warm and fragrant, like summer rain on stone. Cookie sat beside him, silent and still. Ahead, two paths stretched into the distance. One was paved in radiant light, flickering with colors that didn't exist in the waking world. Whispers echoed from it, voices filled with awe, longing, and the ache of wonder. Robert sensed what waited there. Power, recognition, a life where his paintings could stir the world, open eyes, and change hearts. The other path was quiet, shaded by tall trees and lined with mossy stone. Birds sang somewhere far away. It reminded him of mornings spent tending his small garden, of coffee on the porch, of stillness. Peace. He looked at Cookie. She met his eyes and spoke. Her voice was unlike anything Robert had heard before. Not a sound, exactly, but a feeling, words that settled in his chest rather than in his ears. "I was sent to guide you," she said, her mouth unmoving, her presence shimmering faintly. "Not to show you what to paint, but to help you remember what you already knew." Robert swallowed. "Why me?" "Because you still listen," she replied. "You still feel. The world has many dreamers, but few remember how to carry dreams gently." He turned to the glowing path. "If I keep painting, you will become something else," Cookie said gently. "Not worse, not better, just farther from who you were. Each dream you capture brings light into the world, but it also takes from you. And soon, there may be nothing left to give." Robert felt the weight of her words settle on his shoulders like a winter coat. He thought of the girl who cried before the painting of the burning forest, the man who said his painting was a key, the townspeople who came in quiet reverence. His work meant something, but he also remembered the ache in his chest, the blurred line between dream and waking, and the way his hands trembled when he tried to lift a brush. He looked toward the second path, the quiet one. "Will I forget the dreams?" "Some," Cookie said, "but not all. The important ones stay even when you stop painting them. And peace can hold beauty too." Robert turned away from both paths for a moment, searching the sky. "Have you always been this?" he asked. "More than a cat?" "I've been many things," Cookie said with a purr that held galaxies. "A watcher, a weaver, a reminder, but always a friend." The word stung a little. It had been so long since Robert had felt the closeness of someone truly seeing him. Cookie had become more than a companion. She had been his guide, his mirror, his tether. And now she was offering him a choice. He looked at his hands, calloused, stained, worn. He remembered what it was to be invisible, and then what it felt like to matter. But at what cost? A breeze moved between the paths. Cookie stood, brushing her tail against his leg. "Whatever you choose, you will not be alone." Robert closed his eyes. For a long time he stood without speaking. Then he stepped forward, not toward the glowing path of fame and power, nor the peaceful path of quiet retreat. He walked into the space between, and Cookie followed. The morning after Robert made his choice, the world felt softer. He stood at the window, watching the sunlight spill over the hills like golden silk. Below, the town stirred gently to life. Children laughed, shopkeepers swept their doorways, and the sky stretched wide with possibility. For the first time in a long while, Robert felt something close to contentment. Cookie sat curled on the windowsill beside him, tail twitching rhythmically. Her eyes, still filled with quiet knowing, followed the wind like she was listening to something no one else could hear. Robert reached for his brush, but he no longer painted with urgency or hunger. There was no frantic need to capture each dream, no fear of forgetting. He painted slowly, deliberately, letting the visions come when they chose to, like soft waves lapping at the shore. The dreams were still there, but now Robert chose which ones to keep. He no longer opened his door to crowds or collectors. Those who came now were quiet, respectful, drawn not by fame, but by something deeper. They sat in his small living room, looking at the canvases as if seeing a mirror of their own hearts. Sometimes they wept, sometimes they laughed, sometimes they said nothing at all. Robert didn't need explanations anymore. The paintings spoke for themselves. And then one morning, a final dream came. He was standing on a hill beneath a violet sky, surrounded by fields of silver grass. In the distance, a door hung in the air, open and glowing. Cookie stood before it, not as a cat, but as something luminous and tall, cloaked in stardust, eyes like twin galaxies. She looked both impossibly ancient and beautifully familiar. "It's time," she said, voice soft like leaves brushing against each other. Robert nodded. When he woke, the sun was already high, and Cookie was waiting by his easel. Without speaking, he began to paint. The strokes came slowly at first, then faster, as if his hands remembered what his mind didn't yet know. He painted the hill, the silver grass, the glowing door. And then, finally, he painted Cookie. Not the small calico cat who had followed him home, but the radiant guardian who had guided him across worlds. She stood at the edge of the dreamscape, one hand outstretched, as though forever leading the way. When he finished, Robert stepped back. The painting shimmered faintly in the light. It was more than beautiful, it was true. Cookie stood beside him, gazing at her portrait. "You've remembered," she said softly. "I think I always knew," Robert replied. She turned to him, and for a moment, Robert saw her again. Not the dream guardian, but the cat with mismatched paws, the one who had sat with him on lonely afternoons, who had curled up by his side when no one else would, the one who had simply been there. "Thank you," Robert whispered. Cookie blinked slowly, then walked to the door. Without a sound, she stepped outside and vanished. Just like that, there was no flash of light, no fanfare. Only the gentle rustle of wind through the trees and the echo of a purr that seemed to fade into the very air. Robert stood in the doorway for a long time, hand resting on the frame. He felt no sadness, only peace. The townspeople continued to visit his home, though Robert no longer called them in. They came quietly, often bringing flowers or fresh bread, and left with a kind of hush in their eyes. Some said his final painting was his greatest. Others said it couldn't be described at all, only felt. They all noticed the empty windowsill where Cookie used to sit. Robert kept painting, but not every day. Sometimes he gardened. Sometimes he walked by the river. Sometimes he sat by the fire, smiling at nothing in particular. The painting of Cookie hung in the hallway, just beyond the door. Those who looked at it said they felt something watching over them, kind and ancient, like a dream that wanted to be remembered. And Robert, the man who once lived alone at the edge of town, was never lonely again. Because even when the house was silent and the night was long, he knew, somewhere, in a dream beyond dreams, Cookie was still watching, still guiding, still painting the sky with stars.